Hello and welcome to The Anecdotalist. I'm your host, Paul Packard, and introducing himself for the very first time, my co host, Jason McKinney.
Hello, everybody. I am Jason.
Thank you for joining us today for our very first episode. Jason and I will be leading you through an unsolved mystery that is, the Wall Street bombing. Well, I'll be telling Jason what I know of this event here and now for the first time, and he'll be asking questions, clarifying things, and adding tidbits along the way. Since this is our first episode, I want to explain how we got here. Jason and I are lifelong friends, and as such, every endeavor I've ever taken or project I've worked on, I've bounced off of him. And that's no different here. I've always wanted to make a podcast that explored unsolved mysteries, extraterrestrial encounters, and the paranormal. I researched and recorded a full episode and I sent it his way.
And I listened to it and thought it was really interesting. Like most of Paul's stories, he does a lot of research and he brings out a really good story. The amount of information that he provides and the amount of detail that he can put into his stories is amazing. And it always sounds like a good book. And I love reading books. This one, when he first sent me this podcast, I thought it was amazing. But it sounded a little bit more like a lecture than it did something that I think he wanted to be more meant for entertainment slash informational.
Yeah, and I realized that when I was telling Jason about a topic or story, my enthusiasm comes through. So we came up with what we think is the perfect format. I research topics, put together an outline, and I tell Jason the stories.
And I help bring in structure and then ask some questions that maybe need to be asked. There are some things that most listeners might want us to hear more about.
We've had to do a little extra legwork because another piece of this is where we live. We both grew up in Ohio, but now Jason lives in South Carolina. So we're recording these virtually. So please bear with us as we work through the growing pains of launching a podcast. So, with all that said, Jason, are you ready?
I am so ready. I am so excited to listen to the story and sit back while you do all the work.
Okay, here we go. Wall Street, September 16th, 1920, 12 p.m. A horse-drawn wagon arrives across from J.P. Morgan & Co. Bank at 23 Wall Street. Its cargo? 100 pounds of dynamite and 500 pounds of cast iron sash weights. Its driver slips down a side street. 1 minute later, an explosion rocks the financial district. 40 dead, 143 severely wounded, and several hundred injured. Charred horse hooves laying at the base of Trinity Church. Its newly shod horseshoes still attached. At the time, the attack was the largest terror attack on U.S. soil. The U.S. Stock Exchange freezes trading just minutes after the explosion to avoid a panic. In the ensuing days after the attack, the Bureau of Investigations, the predecessor to the FBI, begins its investigation. But after running out of leads and persons of interest, the case runs cold. An Italian anarchist? A psychic tennis player? The Bolsheviks? Come with me as we explore what really happened at noon at the heart of the United States financial district.
I'm putting money on it being the psychic tennis player.
Oh, you think it's a dude? Actually, what's crazy about this story is the psychic tennis player kind of came out of nowhere. As I was like doing all this research, I'm like, what is this? Um, which is fantastic because as much as I love like the whole process of going through this like unsolved mysteries, like we have ghost stories and alien stuff, and then like I'm doing this research on this unsolved mystery, and I'm like, sweet, we also have some like psychic, we have some otherworldly stuff to talk about. A psychic tennis player.
I didn't even know tennis was a thing then.
Oh my gosh, he's a lawyer too. We'll get into that as well. Like he's all over the place. It's really interesting. Um, so what we're gonna do is we're actually gonna run through a timeline of events. I want to get through like the early stuff first, and we'll go through kind of exactly what happened. And then we'll get into the like the post, like the investigation and where things led to. with the timeline, the top searches on Google. So I actually Googled this too, which is funny. And the first things that popped up was Homeland Security and the FBI's websites. So the Homeland Security page has a timeline source. And I was like, oh, cool. I can just type in Wall Street bombing and pull some of that stuff up. I couldn't actually get it to pull up any information. So I just ended up diving into a bunch of different sources across, multiple different platforms, so I could put together my own coherent timeline. And one thing actually that's pretty interesting that I noticed was when you're working across so many sources, there's a lot of variance between sources, and so some of them actually put a lot more emphasis on different aspects of the story. So what I tried to do is make sure that I put together a timeline that kind of gave everything a little bit of space or some time to talk about. But it's funny because some sources spent like quite a bit of time talking about the Italian anarchists, and then other stories spent a lot more time discussing post World War One anti-capitalist sentiment, which I thought was interesting.
I wonder if these two groups might be part of the same crew, or I don't know. That just kind of seems suspicious that all of a sudden, like, it shows you all these pages for Homeland Security and FBI, but then you can't actually find any information on it.
I actually meant that they did have information in those sites. Just the timeline slider doohickey they had on the website couldn't pull up data on the Wall Street bombing. I'm assuming there just wasn't enough information there. But whatever I did in their site, I just couldn't pull it up. So I had to make my own. I do want to talk about several things that happened though prior to the Wall Street bombing that led into the bombing when we talk about the timeline itself. So, the tennis champion, Edwin P. Fisher, he was also a lawyer. He had had several conversations with friends and strangers about an explosion that would take place on Wall Street sometime in mid September. The groundskeeper at Fisher's tennis club recalled Fisher told them about some millionaires on Wall Street were going to get it, and they had what was coming to them. So, weeks leading up to the attack, he actually sent some postcards to his friend who lives in New York to steer clear of Wall Street on September 16th. So, Fisher claimed that he had psychic tips that were tipping him off to this attack. And, the first rumblings of the Wall Street bombing were Fisher's psychic tips that he was getting. And that was the earliest signs of something devastating was about to take place.
Okay, so if this isn't like the most obvious, like, look, he sent out these cards saying that this is going to happen, and then all of a sudden it happens. I mean, it sounds like the psychic tennis player is our leading suspect. Couldn't make it as a lawyer. Let's go try to bomb somebody and take some money.
That's what's super interesting. And there actually is a motive that has to do with money here in a bit we'll talk about. But it is really funny because we'll get deeper into it here in a minute. This is just the timeline part, but we'll talk more about him here in a second. But then also, here's another damning piece of evidence, right? So, a little before the explosion on Wall Street, a mail carrier found some flyers that, when pieced together, read, "Remember, we will not tolerate any longer. Free the political prisoners, or it will be sure death for all of you, American anarchist fighters."
That's that's really throwing it in a different direction.
Yeah, so it almost feels like the thing it's been claimed. But as we get through more of this, of course, there's a lot of moving pieces. So it could be the American anarchist fighters. We don't know. The flyers found just hours before the attack on Wall Street and Edwin Fisher's psychic recollection of the events. Weeks leading up to the event are just two pieces of this giant puzzle. As you'll see, some pieces tend to fit well into the narrative, but others don't. We'll continue to discuss the order of events, but I'll get back to both Fisher and the American anarchist fighters. So the day started off as any normal day of trading on Wall Street. JP Morgan Jr. was out of the country in Europe and at the time. And if you've seen pictures of New York from this era, typically what you saw was busy streets with pedestrians and little car traffic. We've all seen the images of newsboys yelling on the street corners as pedestrians bustle through New York. So you could guess a bomb going off in the middle of the street during lunch hour could have such damaging effects. We know the attacker pulled up in his horse-drawn wagon at the corner of Wall Street and Broad Street across from the assay office and in front of the JP Morgan building, right as the lunch rush was getting underway. And so eyewitnesses of the account remember seeing the driver immediately getting down from his cart and disappearing into the crowd. And some sources actually say that they saw the man rush down a side street. And of course, with any disaster, eyewitness recollections they always vary from witness to witness. And this event was no different. The cart was parked, directly across from the JP Morgan building where employees were sitting and mingling and going about the normal workday, including the chief clerk, William Joyce, and then Junius Morgan, who was the son of JP Morgan Jr. At 12:01, the car detonated, sending iron sash weights careening through the street. Some sources state curtains as high as 10 to 15 stories up went up in flames. 2 blocks away, a trolley cart was knocked over, and President JFK's father, Joseph, was said to have been knocked off his feet by the concussive force of the blast.
Oh, dang. So, I mean, this was a pretty big explosion. I mean, the fact that 2 blocks away, a trolley, I mean, the trolley is not hard to push over back then, I'm sure, just by the explosion.
Well, it's crazy because as I was like reading through there's a ton of stuff online that you can read through. There's actually a ton of pictures too you can look at. But like the iron sash weights, that's a whole crazy another rabbit hole you can go down. But yeah, the trolley cart was 2 blocks away, and those things are heavy. They're made of like, back then, 1920, I can't imagine how much a trolley cart weighed, but supposedly it fell over like 2 blocks away.
That's another thing. Iron sash weights. I actually had to look this up. You have to explain what iron sash weights are for those who were born before like 2000. I don't think iron sash weights are a common thing. Maybe it's just me. I don't know.
You and I both were born before 2000, but I will explain it because I had to look it up too. The iron sash weights, they're actually like 2 to 3 pound rods that counterbalance the weight of like a sliding window. So if you imagine an old wooden window that slides up and down, the insides of the frame of the window had these 2 pound iron sash weights basically that would counterbalance the weight. So you pull the window up and the weights would shift and they would hold the window in place. So they basically were just metal rods that held in place. So think about these 2 to 3 pound metal rods all shoved into this um basically a homemade bomb, and those all went flying through the street when the bomb goes off.
Oh my gosh, the amount of damage that could do, that's insane.
Yeah. So a witness told the New York Sun, quote, I saw the explosion, a column of smoke shoot up into the air, and then saw the people dropping all around me, some of them with their clothing on fire. So a layer of glass basically covered the street, and many of the injuries sustained that day were from falling glass. And multiple sources talk about the amount of glass that was left in the street. You can actually see pictures online if you Google the Wall Street bombing glass. There's pictures of these guys with these giant brooms sweeping the glass into the street because there's just so much of it.
Can you imagine though? I mean, they said that the flames were 10 to 15 stories high. I mean, there's no doubt the glass is all 10, 15 stories high on a building of all that glass like going
Oh
down.
yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's insane.
Well, the curtains on the windows, 10 to 15 stories high, were on fire. So you imagine the concussive force of the blast blowing out these windows, but then also the rods going through the windows. What that would do. So there was a reporter, George Weston, who wrote that bodies, most of them silent in death, lay nearby. As I gazed in horror at the sight, one of these forms, half naked and seared with burns, started to rise. It struggled, then toppled over, and fell lifeless into the gutter. So there's like a ton of stuff. That quote specifically, it was from a reporter, so who knows? But there's a ton of quotes and things you can read online. That type of stuff together. I mean, that's a crazy image. Imagine that. Imagine seeing a burned, like seared body trying to stand and falling, and you were standing right next to them right before that. It's just kind of crazy.
That's insane, man. The amount of damage, psychological damage from everybody.
Yeah, it's not great. So, the investigators put together a picture, and basically what they put together was there was 100 pounds of TNT, 500 pounds of iron cast sash weights, and William Joyce actually. So the chief clerk of J.P. Morgan, he's 24 years old. He was at the bank, of course, working, and he was killed instantly during the blast. So there's like, I read multiple sources that said one of these sash weights hit him like right in the throat or the head, but he was basically decapitated, is what the sources said, which is pretty bad. I mean, he's 24, and just like it's over. He's working, and then all of a sudden it's over.
So this guy is sitting at the desk inside of the bank, or inside of the building, sitting at the desk. and a rod comes shooting through the window and decapitates this guy. I mean, that's pretty insane. I mean, can you imagine how many more deaths there were inside of that building alone?
Oh my gosh, yeah. I mean, there was about 40 deaths, and we'll get into like how that all shook out, but yeah, a lot of people died pretty quickly, pretty instantly. So actually, online you can find pictures of the aftermath, and there's not a whole lot of like crazy stuff online, but I would be careful because there are human remains that you can see pictures of. They're mostly covered up, um, but you're not going to see anything too jarring. But there's also images of what the damage looks like today, even, and so some pictures have pot marks in the sides of the nearby buildings. There wasn't a whole lot of structural damage, so they didn't have a lot of repairing to do. So they just kind of left everything as it was. So you can see the damage from the explosion today if you were to go to New York. So the initial blast actually killed 30 people and maimed or injured at least 300. And some sources state 10 additional people succumbed to their wounds, bringing the official death toll to 40. So the FBI's blurb on the case kind of leaves that detail out, just talks about the 30. But there are multiple sources online that had varying death tolls from 30 up to 37, 38, 39, and then some sources state an additional 10 over that 30 that were killed during the blast. So I just, for all intents and purposes, just kind of put 40 as a total whole number for us. But it is safe to say that the loss of life was immense, and at the time, it was the single largest death toll to happen on American soil from a terrorist attack.
Yeah, this is insane. I was actually looking it up and I noticed the same thing. Like it actually one of them just said a score of people passed. Like a score of people died and then 200 injured.
Yeah, it's crazy. Wait, how many is a score?
I don't know.
40.
I didn't know if a score was actually a number.
Well, I mean, Abraham Lincoln, four score
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah. So I guess it would be around 40.
or 30, depending on how. What an interesting source that you found that they use the word score for like a death toll.
That's what it said. Score. Let's see. It just says score die 200 hurt in Wall Street.
Interesting. That's cool. That's like an interesting, like a unique way to say it. Of the people that did die that day, those killed, most were brokers, clerks, and messengers, and then stenographers. And most of those people were young. The most notable of those killed, of course, was Chief Clerk William Joyce, who was 24. But then also, just as notable, Junius Morgan was injured in the blast. He didn't die, but he was injured. He was the son of J.P. Morgan Jr. It was determined that the bomb was set using a timer. Robert W. Wood, an American physicist and inventor who was the pioneer of infrared and ultraviolet light photography, was tasked with reconstructing the explosive. He was able to reconstruct the fuse mechanism and timer, which consisted of commonly available components. And again, this led the investigators to a cold end. They figured out what the mechanism looked like and how it operated, but it led them nowhere.
That's kind of interesting because I feel like back then, being able to create a bomb, like this kind of sophisticated bomb, would be like the equivalence of us, like you and me being able to create. I mean, I couldn't create a bomb. You know, I know that you could probably use TNT, but like I couldn't tell you how to do it with a timer or anything. Of course, we have Amazon now, but
Yeah, I think we could figure it out.
but they didn't have that back then, you know. So I mean, people with this kind of knowledge, I feel like would not be that common.
So that's a great observation because we're gonna get deeper here in a minute, and there are some people that might actually know how to make bombs. So we'll get talk about that here in a second. Understandably, sifting through the carnage to help the injured was the number one priority of the people that began helping. There was a notable hero from the attack. It was a 17-year-old messenger named James Saul. He was commended for commandeering a car and transporting 30 people to nearby hospitals. And then, of course, the police commandeered other vehicles and they also transported the wounded as well. Interestingly enough, soldiers were called in from Governor's Island. They were tasked with guarding the scene and to search for evidence, assist with the remaining injured, but then also to guard the sub treasury building. Governor's Island was the home of the U.S. First Army headquarters at the time.
That's convenient.
Yep, very convenient. They're very close by. But then what I was reading too, what's funny, even though it's like they're guarding the scene and searching for evidence, their main task was to guard the sub treasury building, and that kind of comes into play here in a second as well.
Somebody knew where that was.
So the indiscriminate nature of the attack and the lack of specific targets and the superficial damage of the nearby buildings, at least initially, the investigators kind of waved off foul play. They speculated a car full of dynamite being transported from one business to another was to blame. And that was actually, pretty short-lived. They spoke with many businesses in the area and found none were moving dangerous materials. So then they were kind of back to the drawing board. And I actually read a source where they said almost initially they thought, oh, maybe there was a cart moving dynamite and it hit a rock or hit a bump and it caused everything to explode. Well, that was one of the early speculations of what happened with that explosion. But of course, that wasn't the case.
So 100 pounds of dynamite sitting in the back of a carriage just randomly explodes, and they think, oh, it could have been an accident.
At least initially, I think what happened was they're like, okay, they couldn't figure out a target. It didn't seem like anything was intentionally damaged or destroyed. And it kind of just seemed like an explosion happened by accident. So I think they thought, and one of the sources literally said they thought a business was hauling dynamite, which is hilarious to think like back then. Imagine now, like a horse-drawn wagon pulling dynamite through downtown New York. Like that would not happen, I feel like now. But back then, like the regulations and things weren't necessarily as intense. So maybe, I don't know. But it was also it was quickly kind of okay that they realized quickly that wasn't the case.
Yeah, I mean that I feel like that should have definitely been drawn off the board real quick because I mean you'd think that we would have safer policies back then. 100 pounds of dynamite being transported through an area full of these big buildings. I mean there were still big buildings in New York at this time. It's not like it was you know before all these big buildings were built. There was buildings there and with so many people.
Yeah, I mean it was 1920, so it was right at the beginning of the booming 20s. So there was a lot going on downtown. Yeah, but no, I mean it was 1920. Also, in the other breath, it was 1920. So maybe there was. I mean, we don't have the same regulations. So the board of governors of the New York Stock Exchange were quick to decide that business was to continue as usual the following day. And so cleanup happened pretty quickly. Many elements of the scene, which today would have been preserved, were pretty compromised, and it kind of hampered the investigation. So there was a rush to get things moving again, and the next day, curtains could be seen hanging over broken windows, and workers with bandages going along with business as usual.
Man, Chris, did you see that bomb yesterday? Well, man, I'm missing an arm. What do you think?
Yeah, literally, they're bandaged up and they're back to work, which isn't. I mean, it's the New York Stock Exchange. Not, I'm not shocked. So in the rush to get things back to normal, the scene had been trampled and wiped clean, leaving investigators with very little to go by. So the following day, on September 17th, the group, the Sons of the American Revolution, an organization consisting of descendants of soldiers who fought in the revolution, held their patriotic rally in defiance of the previous day's attack. The original intent of the rally was to celebrate Constitution Day at the intersection of Wall Street and Broad Street. But the rally held much more meaning following the previous day's attack. Thousands of people showed up to march through the intersection. This unfortunately played a role, however minor, in the destruction of evidence.
Oh wow! So, can you imagine if that was like real lifetime now? Like, I mean, that place would be blocked off like none other for a few days.
Everything would be canceled, for sure. Unlike other attacks, nobody claimed responsibility. And after eliminating local businesses that could have been moving dangerous materials, the investigators soon realized they were dealing with something far more sinister than an attack. And this is where the investigation starts to really begin to take shape. It's said that the investigators went into every window sash dealership across the U.S., hoping to find some piece of evidence linking someone to the attack, but nothing was found.
500 pounds. It was 500 pounds of these iron sashes, right?
Yeah, 500 pounds of iron sash weights, and they went to all the dealerships, and they found nothing linking anybody to anything.
That's a pretty tall order to just not be known where it came from.
Yeah, now that you say that, and I didn't really think about it as I was like looking into everything, but yeah, you're right. 500 pounds of iron sash weights. You would assume that somebody would be like, "Oh yeah, I had a big order of iron sash weights," or they just over time collected these things. But yeah, that's kind of a lot just randomly be like, oh yeah, this guy was in here the other day, ordered 500 pounds of this. You know what I mean? That is kind of a weird thing.
Which is kind of even scary to think about if it was something that was over time thought about.
Oh yeah.
I mean, it just makes you think even more how planned out it was. It's a crazy thought.
So the BOI went into several hundred blacksmiths also in and around New York City with the shoed hooves of the horse that pulled the cart. And the only lead was a statement from an Elizabeth Street blacksmith named Dominic DeGrazia, stating he had recently changed shoes for a Sicilian driver.
Interesting. So it was bummers from out of town.
Well, I think it's more that he could be linked to like Italian anarchist as a Sicilian.
Oh, okay.
But yes, he probably was from out of he probably was from out of town.
I saw Sicilian and realized, oh, that's not American.
Yeah, you're thinking of what's that movie with Wesley, and he's like, "As you wish." Princess Bride.
Oh, I was thinking when you said Wesley, I was thinking Princess Bride, but I don't remember that.
He's like, "Never go against a Sicilian when death is on the line."
So what you're saying is it could have been Wesley from Princess Bride.
No, it could have been the Sicilian from Princess Bride. It's not either of those. But let's get back to it. So the earliest motive to be waved off by the BOI was the assassination attempt of J.P. Morgan Jr. So it was originally floated as a motive for the attack because of the proximity to the building, and also because many of those injured or killed were tied in some way to J.P. Morgan. But once investigators heard that J.P. Morgan Jr. was out of the country vacationing in Scotland, they were quick to conclude this wasn't a lead worth following, and most sources don't even include this motive in their write-ups. With the unearthing of early information on the attack on Wall Street, the BOI soon turned their eyes to Edwin P. Fisher. Fisher had 4 Grand Slam titles in mixed doubles tennis and was a 3-time finalist of the Canadian Championships. At his height, he was ranked number 5 in singles in the U.S. Aside from his tennis career, Fisher also practiced law. You know, at what point, no one can be sure when the tennis-playing lawyer began receiving psychic tips of a disaster, but his brother-in-law had reported that he had been publicly showing his psychic powers for several years. These psychic powers landed him in sanitariums at least twice before the incident.
Why in the world would he get put up in a sanitarium just because he... I mean, normally these days, if somebody's crazy, you just ignore it. So he must have been doing something like... I mean, I guess unless they were just thinking that they could fix him.
I think back then, if someone was acting crazy, they just ended up in a sanitarium. Nowadays, it takes a lot more.
Shock therapy.
Yeah, probably. But he had warned several people of the public, as well as friends, to stay away from Wall Street prior to September 16th. He was predicting disaster. So the police actually caught up to him in Ontario, who's 44 years old. And on their return to New York, they found that he was wearing 2 suits. And under his 2 suits, he had on a tennis outfit. So to quote, be ready for tennis matches at all times.
He had 3 layers of clothing on.
Yeah, 2 suits for warmth and then a tennis outfit just to be ready for tennis matches. Which is, I mean...
Can you imagine what he looked like?
I think that just goes to show the kookiness of this guy.
Shock therapy didn't work.
Yeah, which is interesting because... So they questioned Fisher about his... He knew with detail and precision the outcome of the day of Wall Street, the bombing on Wall Street, before it even happened. And he basically claimed that he knew it, and I quote, through the air from God, learned this information. So Dr. Walter F. Prince from the American Institute of Scientific Research, he told reporters that it was possible he was receiving tips psychically. In the frequency of these predictions, his past history of frequent visits to the sanitariums and psych wards, and all his odd demeanor, the investigators released him to the Amityville Asylum with a diagnosis of insane but harmless.
Wow. That's a little suspicious, in my opinion.
Very suspicious. I mean, he knew quite a bit. And, you know, by the 1920s, the spiritualist movement had lost much of its credibility, and men such as Fisher, however convincing his knowledge was, they weren't taken too credibly. And I am actually a bit surprised that there wasn't more time spent with Fisher, because he did have precise knowledge of an explosion happening on Wall Street before it happened. I mean, you can wave off the psychic aspect of it, but what if that was just a cover to hide his knowledge of the attack or the attackers?
I think it was definitely a coverage. I mean, there's no way. How can you...
Yeah, I mean, what if it wasn't an attack at all. And there was another motive. He just got away with it. And that's it. There's no more information about Fisher. He's just not a suspect anymore.
So here's what I think happened. I think the tennis player couldn't make it as a lawyer, so he helps these guys blow up the building, and he goes and receives shock therapy because he's crazy. And now he's wearing three outfits on top of each other, and they're like, "Oh, this guy's just crazy. He's fine." I mean, I think he's definitely in on it, and I don't think he should just go to an asylum. I think he needs to be in prison.
You'd think, but yeah, that's it. So after Fisher, there's other motives, of course. And so the era in which this took place, I mean, it was a time in which the Old West bank robberies and train robberies were fresh in everyone's minds. But it was 1920. And so it was a little too early for the gangsters and mobsters we read about. You know, Al Capone's name wouldn't even be a household name for a few more years. And the prohibition on alcohol had just gone into effect a few months prior. But another possible motive for the attack was the robbery of the Sub Treasury building.
Yes, this is what I want to hear about.
Yeah, I know. When I saw this, I'm like, oh, it's got to be they're stealing money. So the Sub Treasury building was adjacent to the blast. And it just so happened that they were about to be moving $900 million in gold bars that day.
Oh my gosh.
The building was right next to the assay office where the wagon had been parked. And at noon, just before the explosion went off, Treasury workmen had just sealed the side entrance to the building to go to lunch. And that might have sealed the gold and history from what would have been the largest robbery in U.S. history.
That's definitely got to be it. $900 million. I mean, what is that in money today? I mean, that's
in 2023 dollars, it's 14 billion. So 900 million dollars in 1920 would be worth 14 billion just a little over 100 years later.
That's definitely it.
Yeah, but the problem is that they closed the door, they locked it right before the explosion went off. So we'll never find out if that was actually the reason, because maybe it was a coincidence that they just happened to be moving $900 million worth of gold. and they locked the door.
Nah, man, that's way too much of a coincidence. Way too much of a coincidence. $14 billion just happened to be moving that day, and they just happened to shut the door in time. Nah, that was the goal. That $14 billion is sitting there, and they almost had it.
Yeah, I know. But that alone, plus the fact that the federal government sent troops to stand guard at the building, I mean, it shows how serious the motive was taken. But no gold was stolen, and no attempt at gaining entry to the building ever happened. So investigators basically said, well, let's just drop it, because there's nothing pointing to that. It's just a coincidence that $900 million worth of gold was to be moved that day, and it didn't get touched.
Man, I should have been there in the 1920s.
You could have slipped in, slipped out with some gold. So the next little bit of motives that I have put here, I think this is where we get a little bit more serious into real motives. So the public had been stirring since the end of the First World War, and the attack appeared to be from radical groups opposed to capitalism. The investigation soon began pointing fingers at the anti-capitalists. So I've kind of clumped together the motives here, not because they happened in this order, but because most of the motives discussed throughout this podcast happened simultaneously, with some wrapping kind of quickly and others dragging on. These motives, however, are a little bit more structured, and they all touch on radical groups. So moving forward, we're going to talk about and discuss the organized groups that may have been behind the attack. First, I want to talk about William Dudley Haywood. So Big Bill Haywood. At the time of the attack, he was the head of the organization, the Industrial Workers of the World, or the IWW. He was born in Salt Lake City, Utah, at the time when Utah was still a territory of the U.S. And Big Bill was an industrial unionist. And as such, he held the philosophy that all industrial workers, regardless of the skill, should belong to the same union. His personal philosophy was direct action. You know, he often supported violence as a means to an end. He was actually jailed in 1918 during the first Red Scare and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. On approval of then sitting President Woodrow Wilson under the Espionage Act of 1917, Big Bill, along with 164 IWW members, were arrested. Although he was arrested in 1918, he was out of prison appealing his conviction during the attack on Wall Street. The Bolsheviks promised prosperity and an end to the war with Germany. So the slogan, peace, land, and bread, was the decree of the Soviets. And the October Revolution kicked off an armed insurrection by the Bolshevik workers and soldiers. As a precaution to all of this, Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer had Big Bill arrested and held him on speculation that the Bolshevik anarchists were behind the attack. So, I mean, historically speaking, the Russian Civil War was on, and Vladimir Lenin, the founder of the Bolsheviks, would take his place as the head of the government of Soviet Russia. The Times reported authorities were agreed that the devastating blast signaled a long-threatened Red outrages. Although the Red Scare was real and fears of communism were spreading, Big Bill was released without any proof of a connection to the attacks on Wall Street. And following an unsuccessful appeal of his conviction, he fled to the Soviet Union. And believe it or not, today, Big Bill Haywood, along with 2 other Americans, are buried at the Kremlin Wall necropolis alongside the Leninist Joseph Stalin.
Oh, wow. I'm glad he left town.
Yeah, speaking of being from out of town, he left and went way out of town.
He didn't belong here.
No, he's buried with Joseph Stalin. So the end of World War I brought a lopsided amount of money to the Americans. A war across the Atlantic left a continent scarred and reeling. Military deaths for the Americans reached just over 100,000, but much of the country was left untouched by war. Unlike Europe, most of the deaths and destruction happened outside of its borders, and the financial burden left on the Europeans would line many American pockets. The booming 20s was right around the corner, and many anti-capitalists were driven to destroy the biggest symbol of American capitalism, Wall Street.
Oh, wow. So there's motive.
Motive, yeah. I mean, we've had multiple motives up to this point, but yeah, anti-capitalism. It's the next one.
I mean, I feel like that it's the biggest motive, though, when it comes to, like, people fight for a reason. Money, don't get me wrong, $14 billion sitting there. That's a huge motive. But when people want to stand for something, I mean, it becomes even, I think that's stronger than the motive of money.
Yeah, and most historians point to the anti-capitalist sentiment as something important. So anti-capitalism, it seemed to be the driving factor behind the bombing of Wall Street, but the sentiment was held by many groups. So there's a guy, Luigi Gallini, an immigrant of Italy. Gallini was an insurrectionist anarchist, and as such was exiled to the island of Pantelleria. So here's what's going to happen here in a minute, Jason. I'm about to go through a bunch of Italian names and things, and I'm going to be getting these wrong. So I'm going to do my best to pronounce these, but who knows what we're going to get. But all that said, he was exiled to the island of Pantelleria, and that was for his work as the Piedmont labor movement. So Piedmont is a region in northwest Italy, which borders the regions of Liguria, Lombardy, and Emilia Romagna.
Oh, dang, that was really well done. I would have done a lot worse on those ones. Liguria sounds like a pasta.
Linguini. Yeah. In 1901, Gallini reached Paterson, New Jersey, where he quickly became involved with the Italian immigrant workers movement. And after moving from Jersey to Massachusetts and Vermont, he started a newspaper called Cronaca Sovversiva. His radical views and his vocal opposition to World War I saw his deportation back to Italy, where he died in 1931 under fascist political repression. Although he died in 1931, the followers of Gallini, the Gallinists, were responsible for many bombings between 1914 and 1932. So there was a suitcase bomb that killed 10 during the Preparedness Day parade in San Francisco. Another 10 were killed in a Milwaukee police station from a black powder bomb. And then later, 36 bombs were mailed to high-profile people, including the Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. So you might remember him as the guy who locked up Big Bill Haywood on suspicion of the attack.
It sounds like there was people going in on it. Sounds like revenge.
Yeah, possibly. Well, they're all after this guy because he was locking everybody up. But so after a failed attempt to kill Palmer with explosive device sent through the mail, there was another attempt on his life, but this one was also unsuccessful. Palmer recalled later hearing a thud at the front door, followed by an explosion that rocked the home. The editor of Gallini's newspaper lay dead at the bottom of the steps of Palmer's house. Presumably, he tripped going up the stairs and fell in the bomb, and it went off.
Oh man, poor guy.
Yeah,
That's so terrible.
not a great assassin, but it happens. I mean, he was a newspaper editor, so what can you do? So why not the Galenists? I mean, they were responsible for so many other attacks at the time. And what about the anarchist letters found the days leading up to the attack? They read, "Remember, we will not tolerate any longer. Free the political prisoners, or it will be sure death for all of you, American anarchist fighters." So prior to the attack on Wall Street, Italian anarchists Nicolai Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were arrested and held on charges of murder. Just a few months later, the attack took place. And the following years, a circus of trial ensued with the pair. And with conflicting evidence, recanted testimony, and apparent prejudice of the jury, they were sentenced to death. Many believed this was due to anti-Italianism and anti-immigration that was rampant at the time.
Wow, so Italians were hated at this time.
I think everyone was hated at this time, but they definitely were not fans of the Italians. So protests were held, and high-profile men such as the future Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter and even the dictator Benito Mussolini were outspoken about their innocence. The case made its way to the Supreme Court of Massachusetts, where the verdict was upheld, and later a three-man commission appointed by the governor investigated further and decided their fate. And so the men were executed in 1927. So the Galenists would go on to wreak havoc with bombings and assassination attempts, with a final attack occurring on the judge that oversaw the trial of Vanzetti and Sacco. So many fingers have since been pointed at an associate of Vanzetti and Sacco, an Italian anarchist, Mario Buda. So Mario Buda was an Italian immigrant from the Romagna region. His name will not be found in documents of the original federal investigation that took place after the attack, but historians today point to Buda as the most likely culprit.
So this is kind of odd. You say that we can't find him on the original investigation, but yet all the historians are saying that it was probably him.
Yeah.
Like, how is the government completely missing this? I mean, I know the hindsight is 2020, but I just find that kind of odd.
They just didn't investigate this guy. They didn't know about it. I mean, they were looking at the anarchists. They were looking at Big Bill Haywood, but the original investigation doesn't have this guy Buda. But all the historians looking back, they all point to Buda as the prime suspect, which is crazy. So it's believed that Buda was the prime instigator of the Milwaukee police station bombing, and the bombs sent through the mail addressed to high-profile people. And so with his connection to both Sacco and Vanzetti, it reaches as deep as his possible responsibility for their arrest. His car was the main piece of evidence that linked the pair to the Boston robbery where the murder took place. So historians today believe he's most likely the man behind the bombing, and basically in retaliation of the arrest of his partners. So Buda was never questioned, and he slipped away back to Italy just weeks after the explosion. The biggest link being the anarchist letters demanding the release of political prisoners and his connection to other Italian anarchist attacks. So with Buda back in Italy and the BOI following other leads, where else can we really look for a responsible party?
So this is crazy. You arrest two people, and this guy decides to go and kill 40 others and injure 300 others just because his two partners get arrested.
Yeah.
I mean, this guy sounds more psychotic than the psychic tennis player.
Yeah, I don't know about the psychic tennis player. He's kind of just off in La La Land. Maybe he was actually getting information from God, but yeah, this guy is definitely a character that was involved in other bombings and had a motive, but no one ever looked at him, and he just kind of slipped away. So the BOI had trouble linking the attack to any one person or group or even motive due to the indiscriminate nature, the lack of targets, and the lack of any groups taking responsibility. They also had very little evidence to go by. The blacksmith did recall a Sicilian driver bringing in a horse to be reshoed just days before the attack. But with how the investigation was handled, who's to say that was even the same horse? After all, anti-Italian sentiment was at an all-time high. I mean, it's extremely possible that Buddha was the Sicilian driver, but who knows? So the case runs cold after just a few years, with the death of the 29th president, Warren G. Harding, in 1923. But before then, the administration also pointed fingers at the Communist Party USA. The US government was sure they were under attack from external movement to establish communism or socialism. And after all, they'd just seen the end of a European monarchy that was overthrown by a subsect of Marxists and Leninists. And they were currently watching the rise of totalitarian fascism take shape in Italy.
So it sounds like they're just kind of trying to find someone to put blame on. This is kind of like, I feel like sometimes what the government does is they'll like go back and point fingers at something to like get the rest of the country to go with them.
I think there's just a lot going on at this period in time, and there's just too many things to kind of hone in on. Plus, with how they handled the crime scene afterwards, I think that they just didn't have a whole lot of leads, and no one. I mean, back then when there was a terrorist attack, people were like, "I did it." They would claim that they did it, but they didn't have that. So I think it just made it really tough.
Yeah, it sounds like it was like really, really a lot of irresponsibility going on how the crime scene was taken care of.
Well, also, I mean, President William McKinley was assassinated by an anarchist in 1901. 19 years prior to this, and so the Red Scare was real, and a definitive answer was never reached. So, I mean, when it comes to anarchy, I mean, an anarchist actually killed the sitting president in 1901. Then you had World War I happen. You had the rise of power of all these different, with fascism in Italy and communism and the Soviet Union or Russia at the time. So there was a lot of things happening, and I think the U.S. was just freaked out.
Yeah, there's no doubt, especially just coming out of World War.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot going on. But following the failed investigation, so the FBI reopened the case in 1944. The cold case that was the bombing of Wall Street was looked at with new eyes and by a new organization, the FBI. So the FBI did not conclusively determine any one organization or any one man, and they officially leaned towards Italian anarchists, but they themselves still labeled the case as unsolved. Looking back through history, I mean, more than 100 years after the attack, historians today continue to speculate that Buddha was behind the attack on Wall Street. Historians point to fellow anarchist Frank Maffei, Buddha's cousin, and then also Charles Pogge, who claimed to have confirmed his involvement from an interview with Buddha in 1955. But the case remains unsolved. Okay, so next I'm going to basically speculate because that's all the information that I have. I mean, after spending all this time reading through sources, including government organizations, college papers, commercial entertainment, I mean, I watched videos on PBS and the History Channel. I believe we're looking at the work of the Italian anarchists. The article Blood and Fire by Nathan Ward on crime reads. It goes much more in detail about the Galenists, their bombing campaigns and terror attacks, all the stuff that they unleashed during the 1920s. And he paints a really convincing argument and details around the Italian anarchists.
Yes. So I definitely think I'm gonna put my money on the psychic tennis player though, because I mean you can't make it as a lawyer. You might as well just bomb the banks, And there's $14 billion there. If he was psychic enough, he could have probably known from God that there was $14 billion sitting in that door over there, behind that door. Of course, if he knew this was from God, he probably would have been there at that time and taken the money.
I love the idea that Edwin Fisher was getting this information psychically. It reminds me of like John Klein and the Mothman prophecies. But at the end of the day, I mean, I think Edwin Fisher was just maybe getting information. He was hearing rumbles of things and just was just outspoken. Maybe he was hearing things from other people. And I mean, I think it's pretty easy at the time when you have all this stuff going on and anarchy and explosions and bombs and things. Maybe he was just he heard of something and started talking to people like he had an inside scoop. But I mean, maybe God was talking to him. I don't know.
I think if God was talking to him, God would have told him where that money was at the same time to help him out. Sounds like he might have had some money problems.
I don't know if God would have been focused on the cash or if he would have been more focused on like other things.
Yeah. So I also think that if this is like if it's not the psychic tennis player, like I said, I honestly believe that murders like this, murdering 40 people, is more of a motive from, I feel like you have to have like real political motive. I feel like that's what really motivates people at the end of the day. I don't think it was the money to like, I mean, because to be able to say, yeah, I'm going to murder 40 people, you know, no amount of money is worth that much. I think this was all by all means a political came from a political standpoint.
There has to be, yeah, there has to be a motive, and I think a lot of that comes back to the Italian anarchist or just anarchists in general. I mean, I also kind of lead towards Buddha just based on everything that I read. I know I consolidated everything for you guys here and for you, Jason, here, but I also, I mean, I lean towards, I think, Buddha and the Italian anarchist. The flyers are interesting to me. I think that the fact that all these flyers were dispersed kind of nearby, I'm leaning towards Buddha and the Italian anarchist. But man, I can't imagine. Can you imagine interviewing a guy and like all of a sudden realizing he's wearing two suits and he's got a tennis outfit on beneath that? Like, how wild.
I feel like that just proves itself that it's not him. Like if he's not, I mean, the guy's off his rocker, don't get me wrong,
Yeah.
but
I mean, they said it themselves. He's insane. But he's harmless.
yeah. And I'm looking at these photos, and these photos, I mean, it's pretty crazy. You can see one of the photos of where the rods hit the wall and like the chips in the wall. I would love to see this in person.
Yeah, those pop marks are crazy. There's one I don't know if you're looking at that one specifically. I saw where a guy's holding his hand up to it, and the pop mark is about the size of his hand.
That's exactly the one. Yeah, that's exactly the one I was looking at.
But I mean, with all that said, I mean, I really enjoyed researching this little forgotten event that took place over 100 years ago. This wasn't something that I was even aware of when I was looking to cover an unsolved mystery. I came across this and I'm like, how has this not been talked about more? And this was something I wanted to put together. So thanks again for listening to The Anecdotalist.
That sounded good.
It did sound good.